Welcome back. This week, we're talking with author Kiku Hughes about her graphic novel Displacement, which deals with Japanese incarceration. Of course, last week we just read John Akata's No No Boy, and next week we're reading George Takei's They Called Us Enemy. So thank you for being here and joining me today to talk about your excellent book.
Thank you for having me.
And I sent you a few questions, so let's just get going. I'm sure we're actually going to deviate from these a little bit, but you know, my students just read No No Boy last week. It's my second time teaching it, and this time when I reread it, I liked it a lot more, which typically happens. But one of the things I was drawn to in the foreword to No No Boy, to the most recent edition, Ruth Ozeki writes that reading No No Boy reminded me that history, and in this case, a history I thought I knew, is so much more than just facts. And then as I reread Displacement, getting ready to teach it this semester, I kept thinking about the same thing, that history is more than facts. You know, we know that there were 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust and 11 million individuals killed, but we're reading Mouse later, and that's dealing with Vladek Spiegelman, right? With Art's father.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of my question is, why is it important for us to have more than just facts? Because Takei's deals with history and facts. And why is it important that we have more than just facts when we study and learn about history?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is that a lot of times we don't have facts, and a reliance purely on fact as the only path into the sort of an authentic historical record can be really limiting if a lot of those facts are completely erased, are never passed on through generations, if the facts are not documented or those documents are destroyed or censored by a government. Who controls what we consider a fact is a big part of who controls history if we only rely on the facts. And big part of writing Displacement for me was navigating what I didn't know versus what I thought I knew versus what I was finding later, and sort of comparing what I had grown up hearing from family members who didn't have facts or sources or anything, but were just sharing their memories and their experiences, and sort of using that to dive into the broader factual base, or the broader historical record of Japanese American incarceration, and sort of seeing the areas in which those aligned and in which those differed, and the areas in which the emphasis aligned and differed, was really interesting to me. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm kind of figuring out how to actually reference the character in the book too, because it is you.
Yeah,
So
I know
I may
is
just
confusing.
say when you go back in time during Displacements, but one thing you said there in your character in the book that she mentions at multiple points when she's in the camp is she basically says, I know this history, but I don't know this history. I should be the one who's traveling back in time and knowing what's going to happen, but I have no clue what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And those are kind of powerful moments. And you kind of mentioned that here. You talked about what you didn't know, what you thought you knew, and what you found out later. Can you just mention one or two of those things that you kind of didn't know that you found out about, that you learned about during the process of writing it?
Yeah, I mean, some of the biggest ones were these sort of moments of spontaneous protests or moments of small resistance that, I had grown up, my grandmother didn't talk about camp a lot and died before the redress movement, and was, where a lot of people started talking about more about their experiences. So there was a lot that she never passed on. And I had sort of grown up with this narrative that was, taught in schools a lot of the time, this sort of monolithic experience of Japanese American incarceration, that everyone was, doing their best to be loyal Americans, and, just being this sort of model minority and being very, going with the rules. And finding all these moments where that was just not true, where people were painfully aware that what was happening to them was very wrong, and were doing what they could within reasonable safety, and sometimes not within safe means, to speak up about it and to protest it. As time specifically, I'd heard about James Wacasa's murder from well, not from my grandmother, but from my mom, from my grandmother. But I'd never heard that there was so much push to get his funeral, to get his funeral public and in the spot that he was killed. And the sort of after effects of that murder, and the real, community push against camp authority, was very inspiring. And I'd never heard about that. The work stoppages and all of that.
And see, I hadn't looked him up. You have that. I didn't know that he was based on someone, on a real individual.
Yeah.
You do have that page in the back. And maybe I just overlooked him. Yeah, with Korematsu, Akubo.
Yeah,
and the
and so
others as well. And I didn't realize he was actually a real individual as well.
Yeah, I think the page you're referencing is sort of a list of inspiring figures.
Right.
And unfortunately, we don't know a lot about James Wakasa, besides the fact that he was murdered by a camp guard. But it's one of the things that I have grown up knowing about. And it's one of these one of these stories that is passed down from families that, again, highlights the importance of this sort of de-emphasis of fact. Because I had grown up hearing, he was deaf and he had a dog that he was trying to get, and the camp guards thought he was escaping, so they shot him. But there are dozens of other stories of what people believe happened. Nobody knows what happened, because the only person who knows is that guard who shot him. And so that's a space where fact is less important than how a community that is under threat interprets what has just happened, and the danger that they are realizing, well, not even realizing, that they have seen and are now experiencing firsthand, that is very real to them.
And that was one of the sections as I reread it. Like I said, memory is a thread that runs throughout this whole book. And when I reread this, the final panel in that section, I made my Twitter cover image because it's so powerful. And
Thanks.
I mean, let's just get into that, because one of the key themes is that power of memory. And perhaps the most powerful is when the community makes the memorial to Wakasa, right? And the camp director has it removed. And that sequence, which closes chapter 7, there's a couple of things. I was just looking back over it, but the panel that really gets me is the landscapers, they're erecting the memorial next to a flower. And then the final panel, though, shows the memorial removed by the camp director and the flower remaining. And the narration reads, "A memory is too powerful a weapon." So can you talk kind of about the power of memory, and especially when we're seeing the news with Mouse last week and all of that as well?
Yeah, memory, I think, and that's sort of, again, one of the main themes of Displacement, is that memory is a community history that can't be censored and can't be removed by authorities that would have an agenda for doing so. And I think that is one of its most powerful, I guess, effects, or one of its greatest powers is the fact that it is passed down through generations in a way that, primary source material may not be able to be. The thing about finding out sort of about the big fight for James Wacasa's funeral and for his memorial was that it really showed to me that everyone, I'm sure not everyone, but a huge majority in the camp understood this importance, the importance of this moment, and of acknowledging it, and of saying this happened, because the camp was trying to basically already say it didn't happen, forget about it. And I think it was a big moment where the community itself was saying, if we just let them say that this wasn't a huge deal, that this didn't happen, they get to rewrite that history. And the fact that my grandmother didn't talk about camp much at all, but nonetheless, I grew up knowing about James Wakasa. His memory is in, everyone in Topaz. Everyone who's a descendant of somebody from Topaz has his memory now, because that community decided, we're not going to let him be forgotten, and we're not going to let this moment be forgotten. And I fully believe that if they had not made that active push, um, his memory would be completely obliterated, because that's not something the US government wanted to talk about or acknowledge.
Well,
And yeah.
there's a couple of things that when you were talking about that stand out to me. We don't see him in the book.
No.
Right. So we don't see him, yet he's there, for one. And he exists. He existed
Mm-hmm.
in reality and exists now in our minds. And I'm thinking back to Lillian Smith. I think it's in The Journey, but she talks about the fact that nobody actually dies because of
Mm-hmm.
memory, basically. That she talks about visiting a couple and their son died. She never met their son. And she was like, I know their son through the stories they tell me, right?
Right.
So we know James Wakasa through the stories that your family passed down and through the story that you tell to a wider audience. And you mentioned too in that panel too, that it's too powerful a weapon. How is it a weapon? You've kind of touched on that, but how is it a weapon to counter these narratives too? And I think you've kind of touched on that a little bit, but that word weapon, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's also about the perception that of threat that the U.S. government projected onto the entire Japanese American community. They had so many specific rules about what was considered innocuous for a white person, but dangerous in the hands of a Japanese American. And memory is one of those things. If this is a memory that a white family has, then it's fine. But this memory that this Japanese community has of this murder is dangerous to us. And I think that context is really important to highlight. A memory is a weapon when it is perceived as a threat by somebody who will be negatively affected by everyone remembering this thing.
Oh yeah. But I think about the other way too. It could be used as a weapon to counter that.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah. And I think in that way, I think weapon may be even less appropriate than I don't know, like a healing tool in a certain way.
But you have that too when you come back and talk to your mother. But I think weapon's appropriate there, because how do you fight the misinformation? You fight it with the factual, and this is factual. Yeah. I mean, for the fact that he existed, you fight it with the factual stories of what happened, right?
Yeah, and I
think it is a really appropriate term or word choice. Which leads me to the other question. I asked you this before we got started about Octavia Butler's Kindred kind of inspiring this a little bit. And we never know why she travels back in time. We think it's because of the trauma. It's these connections to the past and her family and everything as well, the main character. But why the term displacement? That's what opens this too, that you think about them as not time travel. I'm taken to a different place too. Besides time travel makes it sound like I have a choice in the matter, but I don't. And then you said every time it's happened, I'm taken by surprise and against my will. And then you come up with displaced. So why the term displacement?
Yeah, it's definitely sort of a play on the, displacing of a community, of being taken away from their home and everything. But I do think the reason that Kindred was so inspiring to me, and Octavia Butler's work in general, is that her ability to take a trope like time travel that you see a lot in sci-fi, and especially in the sort of mainstream sci-fi, a lot written by white men, and she takes that trope that's very familiar to you and reinterprets it in a way that is so much deeper and more meaningful. She did that also with alien abduction and all sorts of like standard sci-fi tropes. And the fact that she's able to do that so new and with such a nuance and such interesting way of twisting it, I thought it was just so inspiring. And I think that her concept, and it's been done in several other books as well, of this sort of generational trauma being interpreted as, or sort of being communicated via time travel, or a character being put into another time. I think it helps to sort of I don't know, guide the reader into thinking about the connections between the past and the present. Yeah.
And I think that's a key. That's actually where the next question is going to. You know, when we think about the past, we think it's done and it's over. And however, what Displacement points out, as well as No No Boy with Ichiro and Mouse with Vladek and Art, is that trauma of the past remains both an individual and a generational level. And there's two things I want to point out. I was looking back over Wakasa's memorial and funeral, and there's one panel where you're looking at the funeral and you say, but their experiences, their traumas still shaped me in ways I was only just beginning to understand. The murder of James Wakasa had such an impact on my grandmother that 2 generations later, it was still haunting our family, our whole community. We were still mourning him. And then at the end, your mother tells you, I think sometimes a community's experience is so traumatic, it stays rooted in us even generations later. And the later generations continue to rediscover that experience since it's still shaping us in ways we might not realize. You kind of talked a little bit about the ways that the past continues to affect the present, but why is it important for us to recognize these connections, that what has happened in the past isn't over? We still see the effects of it in different ways.
Yeah, I think one of the most obvious ways in which that's important is these sort of knee-jerk reactions to threats that a lot of politicians and pundits, et cetera, have in the moment. And the very real detrimental effects that their policy decisions in a knee-jerk move have on, condemning generations and generations to this trauma. And realizing with every event, every injustice in this country and throughout the world is not in the moment. It's rooted in a history, and it's also being projected into the future. And the fact that politicians and people with this kind of power are able to just condemn an entire group of people into that sort of intergenerational prison, basically, is infuriating without thinking about the lasting effects. And yeah,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, one of the lasting effects that you mentioned, and that Ozeki mentions actually in her forward to No No Boy, is where the trope of the model minority comes from. And it comes partly out of this experience.
Absolutely. And that is another thing that I sort of vaguely understood. My mom had talked about it to me before, because she was, she was a kid in the 60s. She, grew up with the civil rights movement, and that was sort of a dismantling of the model minority myth. There was a lot of pushback, but I had not really realized the extent to which the camp experience, primed the Japanese American community to be willing to accept this harmful label in a lot of ways, because after being told that you are, by very nature of who you are un-American, then 2 decades later having that flipped entirely and being like, you are the you are the best of the Americans besides white people, and having that sort of, I guess, like a love bomb almost. I can see why people were attracted to it, even though it was obviously rooted in anti-Blackness, even though it was obviously rooted in yet other othering of Asian Americans. It's just, it's fascinating to me that it happened so quickly, and the ways in which specifically Japanese culture was vilified and then quickly exotified and commodified is something that I wish that I could have explored more in Displacement, because it's a huge topic, but it's fascinating to me.
I mean, it's the same topic of respectability politics, African American, and then I even think back further to the Cherokee and the Creek, or any indigenous tribes, specifically the ones in the South and the Southeast, assimilating, working to assimilate and then still being kicked off their land, right?
Right.
So it's an old trope within different communities as well too, but just realizing the fact that it comes out of this and it comes out of that trauma and that
Hmm.
reaction to that trauma, I think is important.
Exactly. Yeah.
So one thing that I love about graphic novels is the way the medium provides us with information without telling us necessarily, right? And there's a couple of things we can talk about here, but it doesn't occur, and none of this occurs in lengthy prose with pages of description. It occurs in brief moments here and there, sometimes not even through the text. Early in Displacement, when you experience your first displacement, you walk down the street and past the Native Daughters of the Golden West building that has a sign on it reading, I'm just going to read what the sign says: "No Japs in our schools." And you look at it in anger, and you say that the sign shocked you the most during that first displacement. Then when you return to the present, you're driving with your mom home in a taxi and you drive by the Native Daughters of the Golden West building. We see it in the distance, don't read it, but we know what it is, right? So this moment's quick. It's just 2 panels where you have it, maybe 3 panels where you actually have the sign. Now, I didn't know anything about them until I did a Google search and looked at the information on the denshow.org site. Can you just speak some about them? And also, on the ways that sequential art allows for these types of moments and engage readers without overtly engaging them. And the other moment that I mentioned earlier is with Kiku, with you and May, right? And
Hmm.
their kind of relationship. And it's two totally different things, but those are still things that you don't explicitly touch on, but they're there
Yeah,
through
I
the
do
visual.
love that about, comics and visual storytelling in general, is that you're able to sort of slip in extraneous details that are important, but not necessarily the main plot.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, a brief diversion. The way that I organized Displacement as a whole was I started by thinking about what I did know based on what I was told as a kid. These like details and moments were really important as like tent poles for the story, I felt, because the story is essentially about what is passed down to us. And I think, you know, as little as I was told about camp, these big moments I thought were the ones that must be really impactful because they survived through generations of sort of silence. The James Okasa murder was one. The dust was a detail that came up again and again. And if you read any narrative of camp, most of them will mention how the dust was everywhere. And I grew up hearing that as well. The loyalty questionnaire was another. And then the the Sons of the Golden West, Daughters of the Golden West, I don't remember if I grew up hearing about, but Sons of the Golden West definitely was uh, yeah, they were mentioned by my grandmother to my mom enough that I grew up knowing that they were, a hateful organization, a white supremacist organization
Yep.
that was even decades before World War II really trying to keep California white. And
Mhm.
that was sort of their mission. And one thing that I really wish that I could have spent more time on, it's already a nearly 300-page book, but was, the ways in which the narrative around the narrative around Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants in decades prior to World War II was priming everyone for this eventual, mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. It doesn't start with the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
It starts in the 20s with the Sons of the Golden West saying, these Japs are taking your jobs and they're in your schools and they're corrupting your children, and all of the sort of vitriol that and othering that was done decades prior to World War II made it possible for the president to just say, let's kick them all out.
And you talk about wanting to get into more detail there, but I think that's why I think your book pairs really well with Takei's They Call Us Enemy,
Hmm.
because Takei's goes through not necessarily that lengthy history, but he goes through the comments that Earl Warren made. Earl
Yeah.
Warren, who became the Supreme Court justice who wrote the opinion in Brown v. Board,
Yeah.
is very anti-Japanese, anti-Asian, comments. DeWitt, I forgot DeWitt's name, but the comments he's making, the comments that Roosevelt's making, those are all in there, right? So you're getting that. And I had them read Ozawa versus United States, we'll talk about in a minute, that case, which denied Japanese Americans who were born here their citizenship and right to vote, right? And you kind of touch on that. You don't mention Ozawa in there, but you touch on the camp elections and be like, this is the first time they could exercise their right to vote. And Takei's father becomes one of the elected members of the camp in Arkansas, right? So I think that these are important things. And we're reading, we read Superman Smashes the Klan, Gene Llewellyn Yang's book, right? And he talks about the shift in the end. He doesn't go into as much detail either, but he talks about the shift from Chinese hate to Japanese hate, basically, kind of happening around that late 1930s, which we know it happens earlier, but that specific kind of switch within kind of mass media.
Yeah, the sort of target on the back. And, it's amazing to see signs from that time of other Asian Americans saying, we're not Japanese, don't worry.
Yeah, and there's even the discussion in No No Boy about some of the people passing off as Chinese.
Right, yeah.
Right? And I think they're not reading Su Sin Far's book, or Su Sin Far's letters from the Mentor Portfolio for Eurasian. I typically have students read that. But even in there, she talks about passing a little bit too. And of course, her mother was Chinese and her dad was British. So what about the other thing with you and May as well? Because you see the holding hands, you see them dancing together, you do see the kiss, but there's no words, there's no exploration, but it's there in the visuals that you know that there's a connection.
Yeah, and that, again, like we were talking about a little bit before this, that's one of the things that I've gotten pushback on. And even from my editor, they said, I don't know if this is historically accurate, which is kind of funny. But
well, you also have, don't you also have two guys dancing together too, both in suits?
I do, yeah. And I was able to actually dig up some old photos from the 1930s, 40s of white people dancing because they were allowed to have cameras, but same-sex couples dancing. But also, it was important for me to include that for several reasons. First, that I'm a lesbian, so I want, and I know for a fact that we've always been here throughout history. People have had various queer identities and have found ways to find love, even in situations like this. But also, the sort of, I don't know, the erasure of those identities, specifically in a highly documented, highly, a police state like camp, is, I think, one of the, side tragedies of this whole thing. There's a story I read about in a great essay about searching for queer people in camp. And it's a Densho essay, I believe. Yes, searching for LGBT stories in Japanese American history.
You could share your screen if you have it pulled up, if you want.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll do that. And
I can provide a link for it to students too.
Oh, great. Yeah, I can put that in the chat as well. And the author talks about a man named Jiro Onuma, and he's one of the only documented gay men in camp that we actually, have any records of. And, there's photos that he kept of him and his boyfriend in camp. And, I don't know if they're in this article necessarily, but it was amazing to read that and to see sort of, that evidence that a lot of people were trying to tell me wasn't realistic, wasn't true, and seeing that Jiro lived that. And I actually included him in some of the panels because he wasn't Topaz. Yeah, so people, again, this is one of those things where people think they have fact, and then that fact turns out not to be true. Of course there were gay men in camp, of course there were queer relationships in camp, and just the pushback against that specific thing. And it's a book about time travel, well, sort of, and people are like, well, this one isn't historically accurate. Like, no. It goes to show that the sort of the things that we consider fact or things that we consider important truths are very dependent upon the culture. Yeah.
And he looks like he's in that 116 panel with at the dance. I was looking through that again.
Yeah, I don't remember if he was, because he was a little bit older. He was an
Okay.
adult. But he's definitely at the Wakasa funeral
Okay.
with his boyfriend.
Yeah, most
Well,
of the ones in that 116 panel with the dance, their faces you can't see. So I just based off the glasses and height a little bit.
yeah. Yeah. Here, I can share an image again from Densho. Thanks, Densho.
Yeah, I didn't know about this site until like last year, right? When I
Yeah.
was teaching No No Boy for the first time.
Yeah, so that's a photo that he kept that was later found after he died. But that's him and his boyfriend that they took together at Topaz. So people found moments, people found ways, like we always do.
I'm sorry that I had dental surgery yesterday, so like I look like I'm smirking, but my
Oh
mouth's still
no.
a little sore. So, um, yeah, and there's so many moments in graphic novels that allow us to do that. I love the fact, and see, that's something that if you're just reading, when I read graphic novels or comics the first time, I read text first. I'm just going like quick, right? And
Yeah.
you have a lot of pages in yours that aren't text, and you have to think about what's going on. And those moments that you're talking about, those lesbian or gay moments, right, are through the images and not through the text
Yeah.
itself. And when I read it the first time, I like the fact that those are in there, especially for students who may be LGBTQ, right, to actually see themselves,
Yeah.
and then to have them actually go and search for, you know, what you were just sharing with us on the Den show, right, and that kind of
Yeah.
information, which kind of leads me to another question, because this class for educators, and your book did just come out. You said that you gotten pushback for that. Have there been any challenges to your book so far? I
Um,
guess I would say. I don't know if
you
there's been
know,
challenges to Takei's book. I would assume there would be.
yeah, I don't
Um,
actually, I mean, I'm sure there are more than I know about. Some of the ones, I've seen a few comments about, the same-sex relationship. There's also some pushback about including Trump in the book very explicitly, from both the left and the right. I got a great 1-star, 0-star review about how this was propaganda. But I have also gotten, some comments from people who are more liberal saying, does this date the book, including Trump? And, my argument for that is that, Trump's presidency and the rhetoric that he sort of incited throughout his campaigning and after is a part of this history, because Japanese Americans specifically saw that and recognized it for what it was. And a
yeah.
lot of actually organizations, there was a lot of protesting that I went to at the time, and still by Japanese American grassroots organizations saying, we know what this is and we know what this looks like, and it can't happen. And one of those organizations that I'd shout out is Suru for Solidarity. It's a group that formed specifically in response to, these sort of concentration camps on the border, and trying to get them closed and trying to get families reunited, because, that is something that, isn't talked about a lot in the Japanese American concentration camp story, but there certainly were family separations all the time. Families getting, fathers being taken by the FBI
Korematsu was one of them, right?
Yeah,
He was.
exactly.
I mean, he wanted to get what was his dad back with his mother or something. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah. There were a lot of instances where, fathers specifically were taken by the FBI to different camps and nobody knew where they went. There were situations I remember reading about, more things that I had not known about before. If you were mixed race, there was sort of this terrible choice given to the non-Japanese part of the family. Like, you can either go with your family into camp or stay and actually, hold on to your possessions, the choice is yours. There was also an instance that was kind of harrowing where a father was taken by the FBI suddenly without any warning. But what they didn't know or bother to check was that his wife was dead, and his kids had no other parent in the house. So they came home to just an empty house, no dad, no parent. They had nowhere to go. And stories like that, I didn't know the full extent of. But yeah, so in response to a lot of the rhetoric that was happening in 2016, and of course the presidency, and even still, and a lot of reflection in the Japanese American community that we should have said something sooner, because of course these camps were open under the Obama administration as well.
Right, and I was about to say they're still going on under the Biden administration.
Exactly, and Syria for Solidarity is still an organization that is working to try to close those as well. So,
well,
yeah.
the fact that you bring that in, there's a couple of questions I have with you bringing in, the last presidency, because Takei does that too, and his team. And when I asked Justin about that, he was basically like, we were almost already in print and we saw this happen, so we had to say something about it. So at the end of that book, there's actually a section too, drawing that direct correlation. And in your book, what it is we see your mom watching the news and his speeches too. Did that kind of actually happen? Those kind of conversations around those speeches? There's a couple of speeches that you have of him in there, and even who's the guy at the end? I had to look him up.
Oh yeah, the advisor who specifically was like, "There's precedent." Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember his name.
I don't either.
But anyways, but were those things actually conversations you had with your mom?
Absolutely, and one of the first things that sort of drove me to actually starting to write Displacement was an event that we went to that was, I think, co-hosted by Den Show at the Seattle Public Library. That was a reflection on the lasting impact of Japanese American incarceration and how it relates to the rhetoric being used by the Trump campaign. And it was a great event, and I love public libraries for having events like that. It really sort of helped me understand how these things relate. And I went to that with my mom, and we sort of talked about it at the time. And yeah, that is why I think it is specifically a part of Japanese American history, because even though, of course, these camps were open prior to the Trump administration, the vitriol and the rhetoric that he used in his campaigning was specifically, I think, an eye-opener to a lot of Japanese Americans. Like, we should have been keeping an eye out for this earlier, but this specific rhetoric is one that we recognize.
Well, I mean, that leads us to a whole broader question, which we can't talk about and I want to talk about, but something maybe for students or listeners to think about is the fact that the thing with Trump was the blatant rhetoric. Mm-hmm. Yet, as you know, these were started under Obama. They're continuing under Biden. Is it the rhetoric intensifies it and highlights it? So connecting these things too and knowing where they start is important. That's why reading is important. If you like one of the things, as you know, that I had students read, and I don't usually have them read court cases, but I think Ozawa is important because neither you nor Takei nor Okada mention Ozawa. But there's mention in each of those books, No Boy, Displacement, and They Called Us Enemy, about the fact that Japanese immigrants cannot become citizens, for one, and that Japanese Americans, so Japanese born here, cannot become citizens and vote, right? And that traces back to Ozawa, which was a Supreme Court case in 1922. And I don't remember when he came over, but he came over and actually went to high school in California, went to college in California, lived in the US for 25 years, was in Hawaii before Hawaii was a state. I think this may be a different guy, but he left. There was an order about immigration in 1917, and he came back and he was denied citizenship. This may be a different case, but he was basically denied citizenship because he was, a Japanese immigrant. And it went to the Supreme Court. And I'm not going to read everything from this, but I think there's some quotes that I think are really kind of telling from Ozawa that we need to kind of think about. And even his defense is kind of, pretty
Yeah.
problematic because they're
Yes.
basically saying that, oh, he's Japanese and he's not Black.
Right.
So there is anti-Black racism in here. There is all this stuff, but I really kind of want to focus. There's a couple of quotes. Let me see real quick. Let me see. 188 is where we're going to. So this is actually the state. So the state's argument, or Ozawa says that the Japanese are assimilable. They can assimilate, right?
Mhm.
And the state says that they can't. And there's some really important things talking about the history and the way things go. This is the state's argument right here, or part of it, right? Let me see. It was European trade that was sought, this talking about the early days of the US, with George Washington looking to Europe instead of looking to Asia. It was European trade that was sought, and beyond doubt, European immigration, which was desired and expected. Citizenship has always been deemed a choice possession, and it is not to be presumed that our fathers regarded it lightly to be conferred promiscuously according to a catch-all classification. It could only be attained by those to whom it was given, and the men of 1790 gave it only to those whom they knew and regarded as worthy to share it with them, men of their own type, white men. And this comes from of course, the Naturalization Act, which says free white men can be citizens, right? And then, of course, the opinion, or let me give you one more thing. Talking about the ways that race is constructed. This is still the state. The Japanese has not and never has been regarded as white or of the race of white people. Now, the opinion, I think, is important because this is, of course, from the law of the land. This is what they say. This is their decision. And they side with the state and say that Ozawa cannot be a citizen, right? If you want to add anything while I'm going through, just jump in. I'm looking at my sheet while I'm right here too.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just, reeling.
I'm just gonna get to the last kind of horrendous quote. I just think we'll do that. Let me see real quick. Yeah, right here. Okay. On the behalf of the appellant, so Ozawa, it is urged that we should give to this phrase free white men, or free white person right here is what he's talking about, on the meaning which it had in the minds of its original framers in 1790, and that it was employed by them for those sole purpose of excluding the Black or African race and the Indians then inhabiting this country. It may be true that these two races were alone thought of as being excluded, but to say that they were the only ones within the intent of the statute would be to ignore the affirmative form of the legislation. This is what gets my blood boiling right here. I mean, all of this, but this. The provision is not that Blacks and Indians shall be excluded, but it is in effect that only free white persons shall be included. The mental gymnastics to even say that statement. The intention was to confer the privilege of citizenship upon that class of persons whom the founding fathers, knew as white, and to deny it to all who could not be so classified. It is not enough to say that the framers did not have in mind the brown or yellow races of Asia. It is necessary to go farther and be able to say that had these particular races been suggested, the language of the act would have been so varied to include them within its privileges. As said by Chief Justice John Marshall in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, in deciding the question of constitutional construction, it is not enough to say that this particular case was not in mind of the convention when the article was framed, nor of the American people when it was adopted. It is necessary to go further and to say that had this particular case been suggested, the language would have been so varied as to exclude it. I mean, this is basically like, what's the term? Just looking at the Constitution for what it says, right? Without taking into account what's going on. I forgot what that term is. But the point, that they're doing this, and then they even go further on in the opinion. Let me get this last thing. I just had this marked too. I apologize. In their kind of final arguments, it is sufficient to ascertain whom they intended the fathers to include, and having ascertained that, it follows as a necessary corollary that all others are to be excluded. The question then is, who are comprehended within the phrase free white persons? Remember, this is 22. I mean, height of the eugenics movement. Undoubtedly, the word free was originally used, but they're parsing out the language too, right? And it's just, when you're talking about the connections between kind of history and the present, this is a clear connection that draws you from the founding, which if you look at a lot of the founding documents, even people writing there, de Krevka's Letters to an American Farmer classifies anybody from Europe basically as somebody who immigrated here, good. Like anybody who's American is European, white European, Western European, typically, right? And then you get free people of color arguing that we're citizens too, right? In the 1830s. Then you move up here to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s. Then you move to this. Then you go to Japanese. There are links that are drawn.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then further, like you're saying.
Yeah. And it really just, I mean, it's amazing just how obvious it should be to anyone that these sort of racial classifications are just that. They're a hierarchy, they're a class, not a biological like determinant, I don't know. But they are a means of,
they're not biologically determined.
Yeah, they're a means of creating a hierarchy within a society that tried to pretend it didn't have that kind of hierarchy.
And I used to have students look at the Encyclopedia Britannica definition of Negro as they have it in the thing, and it's Thomas Jefferson's hierarchy basically, that white Europeans at the top, I think indigenous or maybe Asian second, and then maybe flipped, and then black, right?
Yeah.
And that was the Enlightenment, Western Europe Enlightenment ideas of racial hierarchy. All this stems out of that.
Well, and that Enlightenment that was saying, we the god kings, etc., and the sort of peasant serf relationship is so barbaric. But here's the real truth: is that the races are the ones that are the hierarchy. It's just creating that same system with different boundaries.
So, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, let's end on this because now we got to wrap up. So, in the book, you realize that with the more people you meet, that patriotism has many different meanings. And we see this in No No Boy with Ichiro when I forgot his friend's name, Kenji. And then even other people he meets there, right? Ichiro doesn't serve, Kenji does. And in Decays, they call it his enemy. They come to the same conclusion. And there's a page in Decays where he shows people who answered yes, yes, and no, no, and then I think somebody else. And he says they're all patriotic in their own way. Right. And can you talk some, and you have two characters, I forget their names, but you have two guys in there who one answers yes, yes, one answers no, no. Can you talk some about how this discussion of patriotism, or more specifically, the importance of standing up for one's beliefs and principles, is important? And I talked with Ben Railton last week about No No Boy, and he I think he calls it patriotic citizenship, where you're not saying that you despise the nation, but you're standing up for your beliefs, right? And it goes to James Baldwin's quote of, I'm an American citizen because of that. I have every right to, critique her, basically, right?
Yeah, or a duty even.
Right.
One of the things that I grew up hearing about was that No No Boys were troublemakers, etc. And that's sort of a thing that I think a lot of people in the Japanese American community kind of had to grapple with as history unfolded and as events as there was more reflection upon what was actually happening. And then of course I went to the switch where I was like, oh, actually the No No Boys were doing this really amazing thing, and I really respect their bravery for being able to do that. And why wouldn't my family, why wouldn't people who said yes, yes have done that as well? And that sort of frustration that I think especially in my mom's generation, who were going through the civil rights movement, had that frustration with people in camp, like, why didn't you fight? Why didn't you do something? And what I really wanted to explore in Displacement with various characters, and I was careful not to give any speaking roles to anyone real besides my family, but I wanted to create characters that really represented different points of view throughout camp. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure I included was not only people who were like, I'm answering no, no because it's wrong what they're doing, and I'm not going to serve for a country that is imprisoning my family. But I also wanted people who were answering yes, yes, because they had a lot to lose. They had a lot at stake, and were rightfully terrified of what the consequences would be. And, you know, people who had family members who were still being held by the FBI, people who were the only breadwinner for their family, people who didn't have a lot of options that I felt would be, you know, safe for them to do. So saying yes, yes seems small, like a small concession when your whole family's life is on the line. So, you know, the sort of grappling with that kind of questions, you know, who is able to make, who is able to take these risks and who isn't.
And I think those are important questions to have. And I think each of these books deals with that. And I'm even thinking about Mouse. I think Mouse deals with that too,
Mm-hmm.
within Auschwitz, within the camps, right?
Yeah.
Those decisions you have to make to actually, you know, survive, for one thing, but then also to stand up for your beliefs and to fight for your beliefs as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for taking the time and speaking with us today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for the book. If you haven't picked it up, of course, go out and pick it up.